Hi, folks. Thanks for being here. This is a freestanding lecture for the MUHL3303 class, which incorporates material that takes off from the work we've done in talking about experimental music in the period immediately before the Second World War, that is 1939 to 1945. And it picks up immediately in the wake of the Second World War, which ended in 1945, and in which the Axis powers, the powers of Germany, Italy, and Turkey and Japan, were defeated, and the Allied powers of the US, the UK, France, and related countries were victorious. It should be emphasized that this period is of enormous change in both North American culture and also in North American concert music. And that's really the focal point of this lecture that I'm engaging with right now. I'm describing it as a kind of watershed, the end of the Second World War, when the forces of fascism represented by Italy and Germany and the forces of militarism represented by Japan in the Pacific were defeated. But they were defeated at great cost. They were defeated at economic cost. Of course, there had been horrific suffering on all sides of the conflict. Millions of people had died, particularly in Central Europe and in Russia. The Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews, a million LGBTQ people, and a million Romani people. And most of the world's economies, including some of the Allied economies, were devastated. Both England and France in this period after 1945 went through tremendous economic depressions. The one nation which seemed to have sort of escaped that, perhaps because of distance, perhaps because of when the U.S. entered the war, perhaps for other reasons, was the United States. And in the United States, the impact of the war was felt much more indirectly. Of course, there were the families of the soldiers and sailors who served, but by and large, it was nowhere near as devastating as it had been in Europe, in Russia, and in East Asia. So this period of classical music in the post-war years after 1945 in the United States, with a particular focus on New York and the Northeast Corridor, is a period in which we see in American culture and American concert music a really interesting, sort of challenging, sort of internally contradictory contradiction between optimism and pessimism. There were all kinds of reasons for both sensations. First off, the U.S. had exited the Second World War as the chief military power because the U.S. had developed the thermonuclear devices which destroyed Nagasaki and Hiroshima and ended the war in the Pacific after the war in Europe had already ended. That came at a cost, but in the immediate aftermath of the war, the United States, particularly in the public eye, commonly thought of itself as the world's only superpower because we had these thermonuclear devices which had sufficed to end the war in the Pacific in less than a week, arguably saving a great deal of servicemen's lives, even at the expense of a great deal of civilian casualties. So a kind of cause for optimism, sober optimism, we might say. In addition, in the post-World War II period, there was a tremendous economic boom in the United States. This is actually an illustration from a catalog of home furnishings in the late 1940s. And some of you may be amused to know that one of the reasons I chose this photograph is because it very much reflects the original kitchen of my home in Lubbock, which was built in 1941. And it has a number of the amenities and appliances which were regarded as just enormously progressive, enormously luxurious kinds of belongings. A washer and a dryer, a dishwasher, a gas stove, clean and new appliances, a powered mixer. This is the kind of household that an American spouse, typically a woman, in the late 1940s and early 1950s might aspire to. Perhaps in a house that was the first owner-occupied home in her or his family history. Many, many people in the wake of the Second World War, and despite or perhaps in consideration of the suffering that had been endured, a great number of North Americans entered the middle class for the first time. Conventionally, we might describe that as people who either worked a white-collar job, a desk job, rather than a blue-collar or manual labor job, people who owned their own homes rather than renting, perhaps people who owned a car for the first time, and especially in the period after 1945, able to send their kids to college. A tremendous economic boom, which really transformed and sort of invented the American middle class, and, not coincidentally, invented an awful lot of American music, including what we call rock and roll. Also impactful, also a core source of considerable optimism in the period after 1945 was the GI Bill. Those of you who have service members in your families will perhaps know that the GI Bill still exists and it still provides for schooling for returning veterans. In 1945, what that meant was that a returning GI, someone who had served in the U.S. Armed Forces, would receive 2 years of college tuition for free. and in addition, a stipend of $25 a week for living money. Now, that might not sound like a lot of money, but that was certainly enough money to pay close to all of your rent and possibly your meals. And so a great number of people who had not previously had the opportunity to go to college, upon returning from the armed services, went to school. You can see in this particular illustration from the cover of the Saturday Evening Post by Norman Rockwell, probably the most famous of the Post cover illustrators, from September of 1946. There's a young man sitting there in the windowsill of something that looks like a university, and his name is Willie Gillis. You can see that on the edge of one of his textbooks. This is Willie Gillis, who in Norman Rockwell's series of color paintings throughout the Second World War had first been recruited and then had gone to boot camp and then had served overseas. And this is the final portrait of Willie Gillis that Norman Rockwell ever painted. And it's a portrait of Willie Gillis returned from war, returned to peace, going to school on the GI Bill. And that was a cause for a certain kind of optimism and a certain sense of hope that the forces of freedom and liberty had triumphed over fascism, defeating the menace of Hitlerian and Mussolini's fascism and of Japanese militarism. It did come at a cost, but in this period it was a source for considerable optimism. Beyond that, simply an increase in various markers that the sociologists like to tell us are markers of optimism. More people got married. They could afford it. They felt they had the freedom to get married. They could get married younger. More people had more children. There was a rise in the birth rates per family. More people entered the middle class and purchased homes for the first time, sometimes in the very new subdivisions, which gave the original title to the phrase we call suburbs, suburban. Places outside of cities, new populations, new townships, sometimes just plowed out of potato fields, in which returning service people and their families could enter the middle class by buying a small starter home for the first time. And overall, there's a rise in the standard of living. People live better. There's more disposable income. The war is over. People have a sense that goodness had triumphed, evil had been defeated, and now there was a chance for the nation to get back to normalcy. This was not nearly as equitable for blacks and gay people and women as it was for other people, but it was the cause of a certain general sense of optimism in what we call the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. The mass media messages sold the same thing. The television, for the first time, this new phenomenon of the television, which could broadcast live TV. Before there was videotape, there was live TV broadcasting, and you could sit at home with your family in happiness shared by all the family, watching the great television comedians, the great theatrical dramas of the 1950s live TV. The mass media sold this idea of accomplishment. There's mom and dad and Buddy and Sis. Dad home from work with his pipe in his three-piece suit. Mom who's been bringing probably Coca-Cola to all of them as they watch the television together in the living room of their middle-class suburban home. I've provided you an excerpt of the models for this kind of thing. One of the very first of the television sitcoms was a program called Father Knows Best, which starred Robert Young. It was originally a live television program. Actually, it had begun as a radio broadcast, but then it switched over to TV. And if you'd like to go over to the playlist, which I've provided to you, you can watch this entire episode, the very first episode, the introduction of season 1 of Father Knows Best. And I want to ask you to watch this and see who is being centralized as the model for what a middle-class, successful, optimistic American suburban family might look like. So this is season 1, episode 1 of Father Knows Best. Bud Takes Up the Dance. Go watch and then come back. So you can see there's a particular kind of model which still gets carried on in a number of later situation comedies, but much of which was set in place because it was a live TV medium with a live TV audience sometimes. And so the laugh track and the use of music bumpers and intros and outros and the idea of having everything wrapped up in a neat bow, a conflict, but wrapped up in a neat bow at the end of 22 minutes of a comedy TV broadcast is pretty consistent. But there's a lot of people who are left out of this picture. People who are not middle class, people who are not white, people who are not cis, people who don't have kids, people who maybe have other goals than are carried in this mass media message. This carries on further in studies of American society in the late 1940s and 1950s. There was a novel written by a man named Sloan Wilson called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. Now, Sloan Wilson had been a World War II combat vet, And he came back from the war and he got a job working in an insurance agency as a copywriter. And he wrote a thinly fictionalized novel, a sort of romanaclaf, about his experience working in the middle class advertising world of the 1950s. This is a little bit before Mad Men, which may be familiar to some of you. This is the early 50s rather than the late 50s and early 60s. But there's a certain sense that this man in the gray flannel suit, like these men who are standing on a railroad platform going to work by train, probably in New York or Chicago, from the suburbs, there's a certain sense of conformity and complacency in the sense that if you fit the model, if you're white, if you're male, if you're middle class, if you're married to a white male middle class man, and you have a job that takes you to work on the 8:17 in the morning from Darien, Connecticut into the city, you can count on life being more sane, more consistent, more reliable, more dependable, less fraught than the years of the war. Because remember, many of these people had served in the war or knew people who had. And so conformity was not feeling like such a bad thing in 1947, 48, and 49. That did lead to a certain kind of complacency, a certain sense that everybody should be the way that we are ourselves. We should all be men or women in gray flannel suits or married to men in gray flannel suits. But it left a lot of people out. On the other hand, in this same period, particularly after 1949, there's this rising sense of anxiety. Even during the war, even before Hitler had been defeated and then after Japan had surrendered, there had been this awareness that in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, who had been a strongman leader in the Soviet Union ever since the early 1930s, was potentially a competitor for influence in the world against the nations of the Allied West. In the post-war period, both Britain and France experienced a tremendous constriction a shrinking in their colonial powers, in the countries that they influenced worldwide. They pulled out of a lot of their colonies, sometimes relatively readily, as in Nigeria, sometimes with a great deal of trauma, as when they tried to get out of French Indochina and led the world into the Vietnam War. But generally speaking, both Britain and France receded in power, receded in economic clout. But the U.S. had economic clout, and the Soviet Union had economic clout, and they had been the two probably largest suppliers of men and material in the Second World War. They were also conflicting visions of the world and competing ideas about how global economies should work. The U.S. claimed to stand for worldwide democracy and free enterprise of capitalism, whereas the Soviet Union was very much in the throes of a model of democratic socialism, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. And there was a sense, particularly in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, of a high degree of anxiety between the free West and the communist East. Red China was not really a major player yet, but it would become a player in the 60s and into the 1970s. So there's some anxiety about world power and who has power and what the globe is going to look like in the post-World War II period. What really changes the calculus, what really heightens the anxiety, is when it became apparent in 1949, as a result of some high altitude meteorological examinations, that there was an unusually high incidence of radioactive material in the upper atmosphere over the Pacific Northwest of the North American continent. Now, in that part of the world, the winds blow predominantly from west to east, and so very reluctantly, but with a great deal of concern, first the meteorologists, and then the nuclear scientists, and then the Pentagon, and then the U.S. government realized that the Soviet Union had exploded a thermonuclear device in Siberia, which had blown that high-altitude radioactive material west to east across the Bering Strait and into the Pacific Northwest. And you can see in this headline from 1949, I can't quite make it out, Russia has atomic bomb, U.S. learns of recent explosion, President discloses. Pentagon shows excitement, but officials mum. Rus possession of bomb peace threat, congressmen believe. So that's a really high source of anxiety. That makes a lot of people in the U.S. who had thought themselves safe because only we had the bomb realize, oh, no, no, no. The Soviet Union, the Reds, also have the bomb. And it precipitated something that comes to be called the arms race, in which both the Soviet Union and the U.S. vastly ramp up production of thermonuclear devices. Not just one atomic bomb, but hundreds and then thousands. And then the intercontinental ballistic missiles that can deliver them, that can fire them into the atmosphere from someplace in Utah or Arizona and have them strike in Russia. and vice versa. So all of a sudden, what we thought was a safe period of accomplishment and prosperity and middle class comfort, maybe even conformity, maybe even complacency, after 1949, for a large number of people, that gets blown out the window. So I'm going to ask you now to go over to another video. This is from, I want to say 1959. I might be mistaken about that. You can check it. It's a video that was produced by the U.S. Department of Defense. You can see that it uses animation. It has a sort of insidious and weird jingle. But I want you to watch the whole video as this video tries to explain to American children who might be watching an animated cartoon both how to respond to a thermonuclear first strike, to warn them of its severity, and then to persuade them that things are really going to be all right after all, which is a bit of a hard sell. So this is Bert the Turtle in Duck and Cover. And then you can come back and check it out. Well, if you watch this, it might strike you as comical or a bit nightmarish, sort of gallows humor. But the fact of the matter, that Duck and Cover addressed a real concern that the U.S. government, and I think probably parents all over the world, faced, which is, how do I help my children understand both the possibility that thermonuclear annihilation could come at any time, and yet help them cope with that without going completely crazy out of fear? And that's a hard sell. It does capture a moment in which all school children, and I remember this even as someone who was a small child in the 1960s, all school children were taught that in the event of a thermonuclear strike, there were things that you could do. Now, it may strike us as sort of horrifically mundane and banal to think that by climbing under your desk in your classroom and curling up in a fetal position and covering your head, by ducking and covering, you could survive a thermonuclear first strike. But it does give you some sense of why people who were born in the 1950s and 1960s, or were school kids in the 1960s and 1970s during the Cold War, might feel a great deal of anxiety in this same period. So after viewing Bert the Turtle ducking and covering, you get a little bit better sense of why, even though there had been material success and lots of people entering the middle class, and mom and dad and Buddy and Sis living in a split-level suburban home with Buddy the dog and the cat and a car in the garage and a washer and dryer in the laundry room, perhaps there might also have been behind that optimism a deep sense of anxiety and maybe even pessimism as well. This map that we're looking at here is a literal depiction of that paranoia in which Joe Stalin, who is stylized with his mustache and his receding hairline and his ever-present pipe, is literally reaching out toward the nations of Eastern Europe, like Romania and Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and Poland and Finland, and he's planting the flag of the communist hammer and sickle in those nations. And that paranoia was very real, even if perhaps it was not so likely to occur, but it was absolutely used by both the Russian government and the U.S. government, and for that matter, the governments of the Western Alliance, which had led to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is much in the news right now, had absolutely led to a sense that the nations of the Western Alliance had to push back against the ever-encroaching threat of communism. And that led to the Cold War and a period of time in which there was a very adversarial relationship between the Soviet Union and the West. And in fact, it's the source of the phrase the Iron Curtain, which then Churchill gave a speech in the late 40s in Missouri, in which he said, "From east to west, an iron curtain has descended between Russia and the free nations." And it drives foreign policy, and it drives anxiety and pessimism and a good deal of fear for the next 25 years until the fall of the Berlin Wall. This late 1940s, 1950s trauma, I would say is not too strong a word, had been the tremendous trauma that was revealed by the experience of going through the First World War and then learning about the depths of the horror that the First World War had involved. Of course, the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, which had been perpetrated by the Nazis against Jews and gays and lesbians and Romani people, mass genocide, the factory implementation of mass murder for purposes of efficiency and literally for the purposes of wiping out several different kinds of peoples. Jews were the most specific target, of course, in the horror of the Holocaust, but gays were targeted, Political dissidents were targeted, Romani gypsies were targeted, and the mentally disabled were targeted by the horror of this factory version of mass murder. And those people who went through that experience, or knew people who'd gone through that experience, or people who had been service people who knew what had happened in the camps, or those who liberated those camps, were, I think, permanently traumatized by the realization that humans could be capable of this degree of sort of coldly mechanized and efficient mass murder. Not least as a result of this growing sense of paranoia about the Eastern European bloc, was the period between 1950 and 1953 in which both the Korean War, the Korean police action broke out, when units of the Red Army backed by troops from the North Korean Army invaded south of the 38th parallel in the Korean Peninsula, it was feared, heading toward South Korea and toward Japan. And the United Nations decided that it was essential to resist this Red Chinese invasion of South Korea and committed troops to that war. Although it was never called a war, it was called a police action. It was never really successfully resolved, but the Red Chinese and North Korean armies were stopped, and there was a sort of permanent division of that nation, at least permanent up through the year 2024, between North Korea, which was a communist state, and South Korea, which was a small d democratic capitalist state. It's a very complicated situation, which reflects tensions, political and economic and military tensions all throughout the Pacific Rim. But at home, the junior senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, stood up in front of a group of journalists, waving a piece of paper in his hand, and said, "I hold here in my hand a list of more than 200 members of the Communist Party currently serving in the U.S. government." It came to be called the Red Scare because it was an attempt to foment concern about the Red Menace of creeping communism taking over not only in Eastern Europe, but perhaps even taking over the U.S. government by a fifth column of traitors. McCarthy was a liar. He was a drunk, and he was a liar. And there was no such list. And there were only a few people in the U.S. government who might once have been members of the Communist Party, which in the 1930s meant a very different thing than it meant in the 1950s. And there were many people, artists and actors and musicians and painters and writers, who had been members of the Communist Party in the 1930s, when the Communist Party freely and openly fielded a candidate for the presidency of the United States, because there was this worldwide sense that justice for workers was a good thing. But in the very different atmosphere, the paranoid anxiety of the 1950s, that same sense of justice for workers, that same sense that perhaps a more egalitarian socialist economy might be fairer to all, was absolutely deadly. And many people were blacklisted. They were forbidden to work or write or publish or act or play. Many of them went overseas. The great actor and singer Paul Robeson died in exile. The great folk singer Pete Seeger refused to testify and went into exile in the UK. It's a terribly dark period in American history in which paranoia took over, that paranoia driven by this same sense of anxiety in the U.S. after the Second War. The result of these conflicting imperatives of optimism and anxiety, of optimism and pessimism, of course, meant that U.S. citizens and artists and fans of art in the 1950s had to deal with an enormous amount of contradiction, resistance, and ambiguity. The world was not simple. The world was complicated. There were many fearful things. There were joyful things and there were fearful things. And it was hard to understand how it all went together because the world was not simple. It was complicated. It was global. It was contentious and contested. And so we find amongst artists and musicians and painters and writers and poets and filmmakers, we find them responding to this sense of anxiety. We find some of them resisting that contradiction, insisting that the world is simple and that everything has a simple answer and there are clear and present danger, clear and present enemies. But more sophisticated artists, visual artists and painters and poets and actors and writers come up with a much more nuanced perception of the world, which actually admits of ambiguity. For example, I don't have a slide for this, but I'll just mention in passing that the great playwright Arthur Miller, one of the great playwrights in American history, certainly in the 20th century, he writes a book about the Salem witch trial, about the Salem witch trials called The Crucible. And it's absolutely based in the testimony of the witch trials that were conducted in Salem, Massachusetts, in an atmosphere of incredible paranoia, I can say, as someone who grew up in the next town over. But what he was really writing about was not the events of the Salem witch trials in the early 18th century. He was writing about the McCarthy Red Scare and about the ways that accusations of evil can metastasize and the ways in which they're very hard to counter. So lots of artists responded to these things. Lots of artists responded to this demand for conformity or complacency by pushing back. So there are artistic responses in literature, in visual arts, in music, and in lifestyles. For example, the great writer Jack Kerouac wrote a book called On the Road, which described his experiences traveling across the country, mostly by driving, with a series of friends, many of whom became very influential writers and poets in the 1950s and 1960s in the Beat movement. The book is called On the Road, and it's a story of several of the cross-country trips he took with people like Allen Ginsberg and Neal Cassady and a host of other characters. Kerouac was very much influenced by American literature. He was influenced by Scott Fitzgerald. He was influenced by Thomas Wolfe. But he wanted to write a story that carried the sense of acceleration, of excitement, of a quest for freedom that these young painters and artists and poets and writers sought. This is a video which I'll suggest you go over to and watch on the YouTube playlist from his On the Road. He's on the Steve Allen Show. Steve Allen was one of the first of the live talk show hosts and a jazz fan. So you can find lots of really great jazz played on the Steve Allen Show from the 1950s. But here Steve Allen himself is at the piano, and he's accompanying Jack Kerouac as he reads the end of On the Road about probably his greatest, closest friend in the world, the real-life character called Neal Cassady, who in On the Road is called Dean Moriarty. So this is Jack Kerouac reading from On the Road. It's an incredible piece of writing. It reminds me very much of F. Scott Fitzgerald in the ending of The Great Gatsby, for those of you who have read it, and I don't think it's coincidence. I think that Kerouac was going for a sort of Fitzgerald kind of vibe at the close of On the Road. We see this kind of resistance to conformity and a demand and drive for new experimental techniques in the visual arts as well, particularly in the works of the abstract impressionist painters, most notably in the painter Jackson Pollock, who came from the Midwest, but spent most of his life working in New York, his short life working in New York. And you'll see in the image of him there in his painting studio on the right that his painting technique itself was highly, highly experimental. The abstraction of the painting on the left is a reflection of the experimental technique that he's using in the painting on the right, where he's literally casting the paint across a very large canvas from a brush or from a nozzled bottle or from the paint can itself. And what Pollock said he was trying to do was to capture the sort of kinesthetic physical motion of the act of painting in the two-dimensional image that remained. So in other words, he's not trying to show the motion. He's trying to somehow convey in the results that occurred, the chance operations of how did the paint spatter, and did he move swiftly, did he move slowly? Something of the physicality of painting. That's what I'll say. There's a wonderful, kind of dark, but really very effective film biography of Jackson Pollock starring the great actor Ed Harris, and I encourage you to check that out. So a kind of resistance and willingness to accept ambiguity in the visual arts. Certainly a willingness to address ambiguity in the sounding arts, particularly in the world of music called free jazz. This is the saxophone player Ornette Coleman, who had been a rhythm and blues saxophonist in Texas. That's where he came from. He came to New York, and he became a tremendous hero of the New York avant-garde, but mostly the white New York avant-garde. He was taken up by Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland, and he had a residency at Tanglewood in 1959. And Ornette's innovation was to take the musical melodic language of bebop that he had learned from people like Charlie Parker, the kinds of lines they would play, but to play in a quartet with drums and trumpet and double bass and no piano, and to sort of play outside the chord changes, so to play lines that were shaped like bebop lines, but that might not follow bebop harmonies. Bebop time feels, but not bebop harmonic progressions. And those of you who know about jazz will know that if you throw out the harmonic progressions, we call that playing free. And so that is the source of the label for this style, which sort of rejects the harmonic conformity of bebop, which came to be called free jazz. This is a period of tremendous gains, mostly under the radar, but tremendous, nevertheless, really important, really foundational gains. that were made in the world of women's rights, feminism, and also gay rights in the 1950s. Now, we hear about those things more in the 1960s and 1970s, but the fact of the matter is that the groundwork for many of those social revolutions of the 60s was actually laid in the 1950s, particularly in these two examples I have here. On the left, we have a book, I want to say 1962, 1963, by Betty Friedan, who was a sociologist and a therapist, called The Feminine Mystique. And it was an investigation, a little bit like The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit from earlier, in which Friedan sat down with a bunch of women, middle-class women, who one would presume had pretty good lives and comfort and nice houses and husbands with good jobs, and asked them if they were or were not happy, and asked them if they were not happy in terms of creativity, in terms of emotional life, in terms of professions or the absence of profession, in terms of their sexual identities. And one of the things that this sociologist, Betty Friedan, a remarkable woman, uncovered is that many women were really very, very unhappy, regardless of the comfort of their surface lives. On the right is an edition, one of the early editions of a periodical from 1957 called The Ladder. This was a periodical published by a small women's gay rights organization based in San Francisco called the Daughters of Bilitis. The Daughters of Bilitis, about whom I've written much more in other places, came together as a very small group of women, some white women and some women of color, some of them middle-class people and some of them working-class people, who got together in San Francisco simply because they wanted a place in which it was safe for women to dance together. And in the 1950s, across the country, in many municipalities, it was literally illegal for men to dance with men or women to dance with women, or for people to cross-dress. It was literally illegal in New York, for example, for a man to wear more than 3 articles of woman's clothing. And if that man did, he could be arrested for violations against the vice laws. So the Ladder is this very important sort of early manifestation of a kind of gay rights sensibility from some very courageous people who said, we refuse to hide who we are. And of course, that's the symbol of this rather androgynous person who's taking off a mask. There were other societies that were equally advocates for gay men, particularly the Mattachine Society. But these are foundations for the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, which would flower in the 1960s, the late 60s and early 70s, but which were really late in the 1950s. So again, we see these people, painters and poets and beat writers and abstract impressionists and free jazz players and feminists and gay rights advocates who are pushing back against the drive for conformity in the 1950s. And that leads us, and this is where I'll close, and we'll pick up again in our discussion next time we meet, the legacy of Anton Webern. Now, we've spoken about the fact that Anton Webern died in 1945. He was killed in a sort of tragic accident. But his legacy lived on. Even though his teacher, Schoenberg, outlived him, Webern's music became more influential in the post-war period, even than Schoenberg's had been. And that's for several different reasons. I think it's not least because Webern was dead and couldn't argue with what anybody said about what his music meant, but even more because Webern's music was even more economical, even more tightly organized, extended the serial technique to other parameters, so not just pitch, but duration, timbre, register, instrument types, all these other factors that could be serialized, yielding very brief, very tightly contained, very rigorous compositions. And those compositions lent themselves to being taught. They worked well in the teaching studio. You could sit down in a teaching studio in 1952 or 53 at Columbia University and put a 2-page composition, a 2-page sonata by Webern on the piano stand in the composer's studio, and you could do all what Frank Zappa called the serial arithmetic. You could say, see, there's the row, and there's the transposition, and there's the set of the row, and there's the combinatorial hexachord of the row. It lent itself to analysis, and because Webern's music lent itself to analysis, it lent itself to being taught, and therefore it lent itself to being imitated. And so between about 1951 or 52, around 1970 or so, the predominant compositional school, the predominant, the most common, the most highly regarded, the most rigorous compositional approach in North American conservatories was serialism. And if you were not a serial composer, if you wished to use other kinds of musical methods, or God forbid, write in a semitonal fashion, you were regarded as not being as serious, as rigorous as these composers who picked up the gauntlet of the 12-tone method. And that continues to be the case through much of the 1960s and indeed even up to the early 70s. And there's a pushback against that, as we've seen with other aspects of the 50s. But serialism ruled. Serialism sort of held the stand in the 1950s and 60s, particularly in the work of this man, Milton Babbitt. Milton Babbitt was a composer. He was also a music theorist. He was also, as you can see here, a computer scientist. In fact, he held a dual appointment at Princeton University in composition and in mathematics. He was one, in addition to his study of the music of Webern, he wrote the first English language extended analyses of Webern's method. So he taught the serial method. He employed the serial method. He came from Mississippi. He was a good ragtime piano player, but he taught the serial method. In addition to that, he also helped design the first analog computers, the ENIAC computers. He also was involved in designing some of the first synthesizers. And the synthesizers were very attractive to the serial composers because it was a way to get a perfect realization of your music every time. They also used a method they called tape composition, or musique concrète, concrete music, as it was called in Europe, which literally involved taking audio recordings and chopping them up and using them as found sounds and combining them and building the composition on the tape itself. Because Babbitt and these composers were seeking ever greater control. They wanted to control the musical material. And the ultimate control of that musical material was to take it away from human players at all and create it on the synthesizer and have it played back by the synthesizer, or create it with chopped together magnetic tape. So the legacy of combinatoriality and of integral serialism in Babbitt's music from Webern is very real, and it's exceptionally influential throughout the 1950s. And that takes us to about where I want to get. This is a composition, I think a remarkable composition from Babbitt, composed in 1964. It's called Philomel. It's based on a Greek myth. And you'll see that it seeks control because it's composed for a tape-recorded soprano with a tape that's then manipulated, a synthesizer, and a live soprano interacting with those sound sources. And that's the performance, a live soprano interacting with the recorded soprano and the soundtrack that's been built from the synthesizer and musique concrète. You can see it's a very, very intense story. Philomela is a princess of Athens who, upon a sea voyage, is raped by Tereus of Thrace. To prevent her revealing this crime, typical horrible Greek story, Tereus cuts out her tongue. In place of speech, Philomela weaves a tapestry and sends it to Tereus's wife, upon whom he has cheated with Philomela. And Tereus's wife kills their child in revenge. Tereus then pursues Philomela, attempting to punish her, but she's rescued by the gods who take pity upon her, and they turn her into a nightingale. And so what we hear in this composition is Philomela recounting the story of her horrible experience. And Babbitt captures her at the moment that her human larynx and tongue are being transformed into the no larynx voice box of a nightingale. And that's what this piece is. It's an absolute virtuoso piece, both in terms of performance and also in terms of physical technique. It was written originally by Babbitt with the collaboration of a magnificent soprano called Bethany Beardsley, and that's the version that's available on the playlist. And it gives us an idea of how far and how expressive this music could be, even in this highly, 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 highly mathematical and detailed and scientific kind of method. So this is Philomel from 1964. And now if you really want to see an absolute tour de force, here's a performance of Philomel from 2010 live on stage, and you can get a sense of just what's involved in executing this piece, which I think is a masterpiece. It's dark and scary. It's not necessarily the kind of music I would make myself, but by God, it is an absolute virtuoso bravura piece. So check it out. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk about other responses when we come back to our next class meeting. Meantime, pay attention to this video. Go back and review this video. Listen to the recordings. Take notes upon the recordings. Make Schmerg details, because all of this, as you know, is fair game for testing. I'll see you soon.